You'll be dead in a minute, human. The alien princess had no clue. The chains were eating into my wrists. Not metaphorically. Not in the way soldiers complain about being tired or hungry or pushed too far. The Keth chains were literally dissolving the outer layer of my skin, one slow cell at a time, working their way inward. I could feel the heat of it, a deep, gnawing burn that started at my wrists and sent waves of pain up through my forearms and into my shoulders. My teeth were locked together so hard my jaw ached. My knees were on cold stone, the kind of floor that was built to make you feel small. Polished obsidian black, that reflected the light of 1,000 crystalline lamps, hanging from a ceiling so high, it might as well have been sky. Around me, 200 aliens watched in silence. Not the nervous kind of silence you get in a human crowd, right before something bad happens. This was a satisfied silence, an assured silence, the kind of quiet that a species makes when it already knows how the next 60 seconds are going to unfold and is simply waiting to watch it happen. I could feel their attention on me the way you feel sunlight on your skin, warm and pressing and completely indifferent to how you feel about it. And then she spoke. Princess Sail Van descended the steps of her levitating throne platform slowly, the way powerful people always move when they have nowhere to be and nothing to fear. She was tall, nearly 2 meters, and her body gave off a faint bioluminescent glow, cool blue at the edges of her fingers and along the ridge of her jaw. Her ceremonial armor was made of layered crystal plates that caught the light and broke it into soft spectrums across the floor. She was, by any measure I could apply, extraordinary to look at. She stopped directly in front of me. She looked down, and she said, in perfect translated standard, that my earpiece rendered without any lag whatsoever, "You'll be dead in a minute, human." The court behind her rang with a sound I had come to understand as approval. It was like chimes struck simultaneously, bright and sharp and layered, a noise that carried no warmth in it at all. I looked up at her. My left eye was half shut from the swelling above my brow. I had a cut there, courtesy of a door frame during the boarding, not from any deliberate action on anyone's part, just the particular cruelty of physics in a corridor not built for human proportions. The blood had dried against my temple. My uniform was creased and damp and carrying the smell of 3 days without a proper wash. I was, by every external measure, a person in a very bad situation. I smiled at her. Not a big smile. Not a defiant grin or a performance for the crowd. Just a small, quiet, genuine smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and means something. She noticed. I could tell, because the faint bioluminescence at her jaw flickered once, briefly.
"I did not speak!"
There was nothing to say right now that would help, and there was quite a lot to figure out before I opened my mouth again. So I held her gaze, kept my breathing measured, and let her read whatever she wanted into the expression on my face. She turned back to her throne without another word. The chains continued their slow work on my wrists, and I thought, 72 hours ago, this wasn't even on the list of possible outcomes. Let me tell you how I got here. My name is Ilara Voss. I am 38 years old, a commander in the Terran Interstellar Fleet, and the commanding officer of the HSV Resolute, a diplomatic courier vessel that has been retrofitted, over several progressively alarming encounters, into something that looks a great deal more like a warship than the Terran Interstellar Council originally intended. I have been in deep space for 6 years. I have made first contact with 4 species, 2 of which were actively hostile on arrival, and 1 of which simply did not believe I was a real living thing for the first 2 weeks. I have a crew of 41 humans and 3 non-human liaison officers. I love my crew, the way you love the people who pull you out of burning buildings, which is to say completely and without reservation. 72 hours ago, we were 3 light-years from the edge of Vale Sovereignty space, preparing a carefully planned, meticulously timed approach that had been designed by 9 separate diplomatic teams over the course of 14 months. Then the jump beacon misfired. Navigation beacons are, on paper, one of the most reliable pieces of equipment on any interstellar vessel. They calibrate faster than light jumps, set exit coordinates, and ensure that you arrive more or less where you intend to arrive. The word misfired is technically accurate, but emotionally insufficient. What actually happened was that our beacon's calibration chip experienced a cascade failure at the precise moment of jump execution. which meant that instead of arriving at the outer marker of veil space with flags out and all broadcast channels open, we dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly inside Veil's sovereign territory, 7 light minutes from their homeworld. My navigator, Petty Officer Yemi Adula, a young man from Lagos who was, under normal circumstances, one of the most unflappable people I had ever met, made a sound that was not a word. It was not even close to a word. It was the sound a person makes when their brain needs a second to catch up with their eyes. "Commander," he said after that second had passed, "we're inside their boundary. I can see that, Yemi. We're 7 light minutes from Venos Prime. I can see that too. They already know we're here." "Yes," I said. "They do. Light-minute math is simple and terrifying. It takes 7 minutes for light to travel 7 light minutes. That means anything we did from the moment we arrived, every action, every broadcast, every course correction, was already on its way to Venos Prime, as visible, measurable fact. You cannot take back a jump. You cannot unarrive. You are either there or you are not, and we were very, very there. The Veil warships appeared in 11 seconds. 11 seconds. I want you to understand what that means. Our own fleet's emergency response time for a territorial incursion, running from the nearest patrol position, is somewhere between 8 and 14 minutes. The Veil had 15 warships in formation around us before Yemi had finished his second sentence. Each one was roughly 3 times the Resolute's size, a deep crystalline blue-gray that seemed to absorb radar returns, and each one was emitting an energy signature that our sensors could detect but not fully classify. Chief Engineer Dara Okafor pulled up the sensor readout from the engineering console and stared at it for a long moment. Dara was the kind of engineer who needed to understand things before she could work with them, which was usually an excellent quality. Right now, it meant she was very quiet, while her brain tried to make sense of energy readings it had never been trained on. "That's weapons power," she said finally. "Are they targeting us?" I asked. She checked. "Not yet. But Commander, whatever those weapons are, I do not think our hull is going to give them much trouble." I pulled up the diplomatic protocol folder that the Terran Interstellar Council had spent 14 months building. I opened the section labeled Emergency First Contact, which had been written by a committee and bore all the qualities of something written by a committee, which is to say, it was thorough, careful, and completely useless for a situation that had not been imagined by the committee. I closed the folder. "Open all broadcast channels," I said. "Audio and visual. I want every frequency we can manage." "Open," said my communications officer, Lieutenant Priya Nair, who had the particular gift of sounding calm, even when she very much was not. I looked directly at the nearest camera and spoke clearly. "This is Commander Alara Voss of the human vessel HSV Resolute, representing the Terran Interstellar Council. Our arrival inside your sovereign space was unintentional. We experienced a navigation failure. We are not in any posture of aggression. We are holding position. We are open to communication. We apologize for the violation of your boundary and ask for the opportunity to explain." Priya related on all channels, looping it. Nobody answered. For 9 minutes, nobody answered. What happened instead, at the 9-minute and 40-second mark, was that something appeared on our bridge, not through a door, not through an airlock, simply appeared, the way a projection appears on a screen, except it was not a projection. It was real, and physical, and breathing, and standing 2 meters from my command chair, with the kind of posture that made it very clear it had never been uncertain about anything in its life. It was a veil, and then there were 4 more of them, forming a loose arc, and then, walking through that arc, there was the princess. She was conducting a territorial inspection in person. I learned later, much later, how profound an insult that was. In Veil culture, a sovereign conducting a personal boarding of a foreign vessel was an act reserved exclusively for situations of absolute contempt, the diplomatic equivalent of refusing to let someone in through the front door and instead inspecting their shoes on the doorstep. She had not come to speak with us. She had come to make clear what she thought of us. I did not know any of that at the time. What I knew at the time was that an extremely tall, luminous, armored alien had materialized on my bridge, and that every instinct I had was telling me to be very careful and very human about the next 30 seconds. So I did what humans do. I stood up. I walked toward her at a calm, measured pace that was meant to communicate openness rather than aggression. I held out my right hand, fingers extended, palms slightly upward in the traditional gesture that humans have been using for thousands of years, to show that the hand holds no weapon, and that the person attached to it means no harm. "Commander Alara Voss," I said, "I'm glad you came." She looked at my hand. The expression on her face, translated through bioluminescent body language I was not yet equipped to read, was one I would later understand as something between confusion and mild revulsion. But in the moment, it simply looked like stillness, so I waited another second, and then gently lowered my hand. Then things started going wrong very quickly. My chief engineer, Dara, was at the back of the bridge. She needed to get my attention. On a normal day, she would have touched the communication pin on her collar and whispered into it. On a normal day, however, Priya would have been the one on communications. But Priya had stepped to the secondary console to manage the broadcast loop, which meant Dara was doing what people do when they need someone's attention and can't reach them electronically. She whistled. It was a short, sharp, functional whistle, the kind used on ship decks the world over to cut through noise. 2 notes, high and descending. The effect on the Vale boarding party was instantaneous. Every single one of them went rigid. The temperature on the bridge dropped, or at least it felt like it did. The princess went very still, in a way that was categorically different from the stillness she had shown before. This stillness was not composed. This stillness was something else entirely. I had no way of knowing, right then, that the 2-note descending whistle is, in Vale culture, a ritual pronunciation of a formal death wish directed at the soul of a living being. It is the single most serious social transgression a person can commit in Vale society. It is so serious that there is no word for it in standard diplomatic glossaries, because no one had ever imagined that a species encountering the Vale for the first time would lead with it. And then my ship's medic, Lieutenant Callum Pierce, who had been standing near the starboard console and who was simply trying to do what any good medic does when foreign beings appear in his workspace, he looked directly at the Vale soldier nearest to him. Direct, open, assessing, medical eye contact. The kind of look that says, "I am evaluating your health." In Vale culture, direct sustained eye contact is a formal challenge to mortal combat. Callum, to his credit, immediately sensed that something had gone badly, because the Vale soldier took a step back and made a sound deep in its chest that did not need translation. I stepped between them. "He means no disrespect," I said clearly. "He's a medic. Looking at people is part of his function." There was a beat of silence in which I could feel the diplomatic situation doing something very much like a ship losing thruster power and beginning to drift toward a gravity well. And then I made my own mistake. I was trying to de-escalate. I was trying to demonstrate goodwill. I reached into the cargo pocket of my uniform, where I had been carrying a protein ration bar since leaving the mess hall that morning, the kind of dense, calorie-packed food block that sustained human beings through long shifts and difficult days. In many cultures, offering food is the oldest possible gesture of peace. It says, "I have something that sustains life. I am choosing to give it to you, rather than use it to sustain myself. I mean you well." I held it out to the princess. She looked at the small rectangular bar in my palm. She looked at me. The expression on her face was one I would eventually learn to recognize as profound personal affront, the Vale equivalent of being offered something so far below what was owed as to constitute a second insult layered on top of the first. She said one word in Vale. My translation matrix rendered it 17 seconds later, which was 17 seconds too late to do anything about it. The word was arrest. The keth chains appeared on my wrists before I could say another word. They were not placed there by hands. They materialized, the same way the boarding party had, solid and immediate, and already beginning their slow dissolving work. I felt the heat of them immediately. Around me, I heard the sounds of the rest of my crew meeting similar fates. Not the chains. They were reserved for the commanding officer, but restraints of various kinds. Fields that froze movement, barriers that divided them into groups. Priya caught my eye from across the bridge. She was not panicking. None of them were. I had trained a good crew. "It's going to be fine," I said, loudly enough for all of them to hear. I didn't know yet if that was true, but I said it anyway. because that is what you do when you are the person your crew is looking at. The princess gave me one last look before she turned away. It was a brief look, barely a second long, but it carried something in it that I catalogued carefully, a flicker of something that was not contempt. Not curiosity exactly. More like the look of a person who has just noticed something that does not fit the pattern they were expecting, something small and out of place. Not important, probably, but there. I filed that look away. Because in my experience, that look is always where things begin. They transported us down to the detention facility on the orbital station above Vanos Prime. The journey took less than 4 minutes from the moment of the arrest to the moment the cell door sealed behind me. Efficient, thorough, completely certain of itself, the way systems are when they have never needed to account for exceptions. I stood in the center of my cell and looked around at its architecture. It was designed to be inescapable. I could see exactly how it worked. Atmospheric sensors feeding into a central processor that monitored biological requirements and adjusted the environment accordingly. Energy field emitters set into the walls, calibrated to the species inside. Pain delivery mechanisms positioned at intervals, designed to discourage physical attempts at the barriers. A sleep induction system that would activate automatically at intervals to prevent exhaustion from driving desperate behavior. Thorough, thoughtful, built on thousands of years of experience, keeping living things contained. I sat down on the floor in the center of the cell, cross-legged, and I began to think. The chains were gone, replaced by the cell itself. My wrists were red and tender, but the damage was superficial, at least for now. I was fed, mostly. I was not in immediate physical danger. My crew was somewhere on this station, alive, because the princess had no reason to harm them. They were witnesses, and diplomatic cargo, not threats. The situation was bad. It was not, however, as bad as it had been at several other points in my career, and more importantly, it was not yet over. My mother used to say, when I was young and something had gone wrong, and I was sitting in the particular slumped posture of a child who has decided that everything is ruined, "Ilara, is it over?" And if I said yes, she would say, "Then why are you still breathing?" I was still breathing. So it was not over. I looked at the walls of my cell, at the seams where panels met, at the faint hum of the emitters, at the placement of the atmospheric vents, at the angle of the surveillance lens in the upper corner. I started counting things. That's where the plan began. Not with a dramatic decision, not with a moment of inspiration, just with a person sitting quietly in a room that was meant to hold her, counting things, and thinking. Outside the cell, the stars of an unfamiliar part of the galaxy burned cold and indifferent. Inside it, I was just getting started. The cell had 37 seams. I counted them twice to be sure, running my eyes along the walls in a slow, methodical grid pattern, the kind of visual sweep that pilots use when checking an aircraft exterior before a flight. 37 places where panel met panel, where material changed grade or thickness, where a construction crew had needed to join two separate pieces of something together. Each seam was a potential variance. Each variance was information. The surveillance lens was in the upper left corner, angled to cover approximately 80% of the cell's interior. The remaining 20% existed in a blind spot near the floor along the right wall. The veil had almost certainly mapped this blind spot, and determined it was not large enough to allow any meaningful activity, which was probably true for most species. I am not most species. I moved to the right wall and sat with my back against it, below the lens's angle of coverage. Not to do anything yet, just to be somewhere that was mine. The atmospheric vents ran along the upper edge of the far wall, small horizontal slots that allowed air circulation. The air coming through them was carefully calibrated. I could tell by the even, measured quality of it. Enough oxygen for a human, temperature held at approximately what an Earth body calls comfortable, neutral, designed to keep me functional, without being pleasant enough to feel like anything other than containment. I breathed it in and out and thought about what I knew. The Veil Sovereignty had been on Terran intelligence radar for approximately 8 years, not because we had made contact, but because we had picked up their signal traffic at the outer edge of their space during a survey mission, and because 2 unmanned probes sent toward their boundary had stopped transmitting without returning any data on what had stopped them. The Terran Interstellar Council had classified the Veil as a Priority 1 contact scenario, meaning approach with maximum preparation, minimum assumptions, and absolute diplomatic patience. 14 months of preparation. 4 navigation specialists, 9 diplomatic architects, 2 xenosociological teams, and 1 300-page approach protocol, and a beacon chip that chose the worst possible moment to fail. I let out a long, slow breath, and did not waste any energy on frustration. Frustration is a tool for later, for after, for the moment when you have enough space to sit with what went wrong and learn from it. Right now, it was just dead weight. What I did know about the Veil, from all those months of pre-contact intelligence building, was limited but important. They were old. Not old the way a human civilization of 4,000 or 5,000 years is old, but old in a way that stretched back tens of thousands of years in their own historical records, which their signal traffic had allowed us to partially decode. They were technologically extraordinary. Their jump capability made ours look like a child's paper airplane next to a supersonic jet. They were telepathic within their own species, not in any mystical sense, but in a hard biological sense. Their neural architecture allowed a low-frequency bioelectrical communication that worked at close range and eliminated a great deal of the guesswork that characterized most inter-individual communication. They had never lost a war in recorded history. That last one was the thing that mattered most, right now. A species that has never lost a war does not develop the kinds of mental muscles that come from losing. It does not develop adaptability, born from failure. It does not develop the particular desperate creativity that comes from being forced to find a new approach, because every familiar approach has been tried and beaten. It develops certainty. It develops pattern recognition built on an unbroken record of success. It develops systems and protocols that are extremely effective at handling situations it has encountered before. It has very little practice with situations it has not encountered before, and it had never encountered humans before. That thought was still sitting in the front of my mind, warm and promising, when the door panel at the far end of my cell lit up and then opened. The being who stepped through was not a guard. Guards had a particular way of moving, everywhere in the universe, a watchful but disengaged quality, present without being interested. This being moved the way scientists move, with forward attention, with the particular posture of someone who is about to observe something and wants to miss nothing. He was Veil, slightly shorter than the princess, with bioluminescence that ran more green than blue along his jaw and hands. His ceremonial markers, the kind of crystalline badges that seemed to indicate rank or role among the Veil, were arranged differently from the guards, more clustered at the chest, fewer at the shoulder. He carried a tablet, a thin piece of what appeared to be flat crystal, that lit from within when he touched it. He stopped just inside the door and looked at me. I looked back. He made a notation on his tablet. "You're not what I was told to expect," I said. He made another notation. Then he said, in translated standard, "What were you told to expect?" "Nobody told me anything specific," I said. "I'm judging by how you're standing and what you're carrying. You're here to study me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." "That's interesting," I said. "Why is it interesting?" "Because it means you don't already know everything about me, which means your files on humans are incomplete, which means this is new territory for you too." He made a longer notation this time. His name, or the approximation that the translation matrix settled on, was Vayan Keth. He was, as I had guessed, a scholar, specifically a xenobiologist, assigned to study the physiological responses of detained foreign species. It was, in Veil terms, a minor academic posting. The Veil had detained hundreds of species over their long history. The data on foreign biology was extensive. His job was routine annotation. Or it had been, until I started asking him questions. Not about the cell, not about escape routes or guard schedules, or what I would need to know to get out of here. I asked him about the Veil, about their architecture, why the ceiling in the court was so high, whether it served a structural purpose or a ceremonial one, about their bioluminescence, whether it was involuntary, like a blush, or whether they had conscious control over it, about whether the crystalline tablet he carried was a manufactured material or a grown one. He answered the ceiling question first, cautiously, with the tone of someone who is not sure why they are answering but cannot find a good reason not to. Structural and ceremonial, he said. The height created acoustic properties that amplified the harmonic chime of group approval, which had social bonding functions in large gatherings. Then he answered the bioluminescence question. Partially voluntary, he said. Base luminescence was involuntary and reflected emotional state. Intentional brightening or dimming was possible with practice and was considered a social skill. Then, almost despite himself, he answered the question about the tablet. Grown, he said, from a specific mineral compound found only in the deep crust of Vanos Prime, encouraged into flat growth patterns over decades by careful mineral feeding. By the time he had answered the third question, he had stopped making notations and was simply talking. This is the thing about curiosity. Real curiosity, the kind that is not performed for effect but is simply present because something is genuinely interesting. It is contagious. Vayan Keth had spent years studying foreign species. He had never had one study him back. He had certainly never had one do it with apparent pleasure. I was not performing pleasure. That was the thing. I was actually interested. The grown tablets were fascinating. The acoustic architecture of the court was fascinating. Everything about the veil was fascinating. Not in a frightening way, but in the way that all genuinely new things are fascinating, when you let yourself simply be present with them. My second-year instructor at the academy, a retired captain named Harlan Cross, used to say that the most valuable tool a diplomat could carry was not a translation matrix or a knowledge of protocol, but a sincere interest in other people. Other beings will forgive you almost anything, he told us, if they believe you are genuinely curious about them. Curiosity means you don't see them as a threat. It means you see them as a story worth hearing. Most beings, in most places, have never had that from a stranger. I thought about Harlan often, in the years that followed. I thought about him now, sitting on the floor of an alien cell, watching a Veil scholar slowly become interested in the conversation he had come to observe, not participate in. You're not afraid, Vayan Keth said, after about an hour. I'm not afraid, I agreed. Most detained subjects exhibit fear responses within the first 20 minutes. Elevated respiration, elevated heart rate, attempts to establish escape parameters. He said this as fact, not as a judgment. You have done none of those things. I've been assessing the cell, I said honestly. That's not quite the same as planning escape. More like gathering information. For what purpose? I don't know yet, I said. But information is always useful eventually. He made a notation. Then he said, with what I was beginning to read as careful precision, you will be executed tomorrow. I know, I said. That information does not appear to distress you. It distresses me, I said. But distress isn't useful right now, so I'm setting it aside. He looked at me for a long time. In a human face, I would have read that look as something between confusion and recalibration, the look of a person updating a picture of the world that has just been proven slightly wrong. On a Veil face, with the bioluminescence at the jaw giving off a faint, thoughtful pulse, it looked different but meant, I suspected, something similar. You said, he began slowly, that our files on humans were incomplete. Almost certainly. What would complete them? I looked at him. What do you want to know? What you are, he said. Not biologically. I have the biological readings. What you are. I sat with that for a moment, because it was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. We're the species that almost did not make it, I said. Early in our history, we nearly ended ourselves several times. Disease, conflict, environmental collapse. Each time, something in us refused to stay ended. We rebuilt, we adapted. We got very good at continuing past the point where continuing seemed reasonable. All species exhibit survival instinct, Vayan Keth said. Not like this, I said. Survival instinct says stop when the math says stop. Ours says keep going and recalculate the math later. He was quiet for a moment. That sounds like a flaw. It has been, sometimes, I admitted. We have a long history of making things much harder for ourselves than they needed to be. But when things get hard from the outside, when something external is trying to stop us, it becomes something else. What does it become? I thought about how to explain it simply and accurately. Have you ever tried to hold a door closed against someone who doesn't believe the door should be closed? Someone who is completely certain, not angry, not aggressive, just fundamentally certain, that the door is going to open. He considered this metaphor. A persistent force. A persistent force that does not interpret resistance as information. Most things, when they push against something and find it doesn't move, update their behavior. We push harder and look for the hinge. He made a very long notation. After he left, I lay on the narrow surface that served as a bed and thought about the execution. The Keth chains. I had felt them during the arrest, briefly, before the veil had switched to the cell-based containment system for transport. 60 seconds of operation was the standard cycle, long enough for any known biological system to reach critical failure under the dissolution process. After 60 seconds, the chains powered down automatically. The mechanism was elegant. The chain did not need to continue beyond its operational limit because, in 60 seconds, there was nothing left to continue against. That was the assumption. I thought about pain thresholds. The veil had calibrated the Keth chains for their own physiology, naturally. They had calibrated them against every other species they had detained, adjusting the dissolution rate and the pain delivery accordingly. They had built a database of biological responses across hundreds of species. They were thorough. They were careful. What they had never done was calibrate for a species that had spent 10,000 years of recorded history inventing new ways to tolerate, override, and push through pain. Humans do not have an unusually high pain threshold by any natural biological measure. We are not numb to pain. We are not resistant to it, the way certain cold-adapted species are resistant to cold. We feel it fully and completely. What we have, instead, is a relationship with pain that is unlike anything else in the biology of endurance. We trained. We practiced. We built entire cultural systems around the concept of continuing to function inside pain, rather than stopping because of it. Athletes, soldiers, explorers, people who ran across frozen tundra and mountain ranges and deserts, not because they were unaware of the suffering involved, but because they had made a deliberate decision that the suffering was acceptable and the stopping was not. The Keth chains would hurt. They would hurt enormously. And they would complete their 60-second cycle on a body that was still, through nothing more than absolute human stubbornness, functional. I did not know this for certain. It was a calculation, not a guarantee. There were variables I could not account for. The dissolution process might be more aggressive than I was estimating. The pain might cross some threshold I could not train past. The 60 seconds might be longer subjectively than I could hold. But I knew one other thing. I had asked Van Keth, in what seemed like a casual tangent near the end of our conversation, what happened in Vale law if an executed prisoner survived the execution. He had looked at me with the expression of someone hearing a question so far outside the realm of possibility that they had no ready answer for it. Then he had looked it up. The continuance provision. Ancient law, so old it was considered more philosophical than legal. If a condemned prisoner survived the method of their execution, they were considered to have been demonstrated innocent by the continuance itself, the Veil's term for the cosmic order, that they believed governed all things. They could not be executed again for the same offense. They had to be released, and the sovereign who had condemned them owed a Keth debt, a formal obligation of restitution. He told me this with the tone of a person who finds the information interesting from a historical perspective and completely irrelevant to the present situation. I told him I found it interesting too. I did not tell him why. After he was gone, I stayed awake for a long time, running through the calculation again and again, not because I needed to keep checking it, but because repetition in the dark hours before something difficult is how some people pray, and how I, who did not pray, prepared. The math said it was impossible. The math said 60 seconds under Keth chain dissolution, calibrated against Veil pain tolerance, which was already extraordinary by any external measure, should produce unconsciousness in most known species within 20 seconds, and complete biological incapacitation within 40. The math had been calculated by beings who had never stood in a cold tide pool in the mountains of northern Wales at 2 in the morning during winter training, who had never held a position in a suit of damaged gear for 6 hours during the Korath crisis because the relief team was delayed, and leaving the position meant certain loss of the outpost and everyone in it, Who had never watched a human marathon runner cross a finish line at the hour mark looking like they had already died twice and were simply refusing to acknowledge it? The math did not know about humans. That was the thing the math kept missing. I closed my eyes. Outside, the orbital station hummed with the orderly machinery of Veil efficiency, every system running within expected parameters, every protocol playing out exactly as designed, the whole enormous structure completely certain of what tomorrow would bring. I let it be certain. Certainty in other people has always made me pay closer attention. I breathed slowly, measured my own heartbeat, and went through the mental discipline routine I had learned during my second year at the academy, the one designed to quiet the parts of the nervous system that do unhelpful things in the dark. In 4 breaths, hold 2, out 4, hold 2, repeat. Somewhere on this station my crew was sleeping or not sleeping, waiting, trusting. In 4 breaths, hold 2. I would not waste that trust. Out 4, hold 2. The chains would hurt, and I would still be standing when they finished. That was the plan. It was not a good plan. But it was a human plan, and in my experience, those are often the only kind that account for what everyone else has already decided cannot happen. Tomorrow, I was going to walk into the Grand Court of the Veil Sovereignty, in front of 200 witnesses, and an open broadcast to 17 star systems. And I was going to demonstrate, in the most direct and unambiguous way available to me, exactly what the files on humans had missed. I almost felt sorry for the princess. Almost. I slept. Morning, if it could be called that, came without any of the signals I normally associated with it. No change in light through a window because there was no window. No sound of the station's activity shifting from nighttime stillness to daytime energy, because the Veil orbital station operated at the same measured efficiency around the clock, every system calibrated to its function, nothing rising or falling in response to the biological rhythms of the beings inside it. The nutrition paste that appeared through a small slot in the wall at regular intervals gave no indication of the hour. What told me it was morning was Vian Keth. He arrived with less of the careful observational distance he had carried on his first visit. He was moving quickly, and he was trying not to look like he was moving quickly, which I recognized as the behavior of someone who has something to say and is not sure they should say it. "You slept," he said, as he came through the door. "I did," I said. "For a sustained period." The biological monitors registered deep sleep cycles beginning approximately 4 hours after lights down and continuing until 30 minutes ago. "I needed the rest," I said. "Today seems important." He set his tablet down on the narrow ledge near the door, which he had not done before. Setting down a tool is a small thing, but it is the gesture of someone who is settling in, rather than observing from a distance. I noted it without drawing attention to it. "There was significant discussion last night," he said, "in the academic community. About you." "About me specifically, or about humans?" "Both." He picked up the tablet again, and then set it back down. "Your behavior during detention has been recorded and reviewed. The fact that you slept has been noted. I imagine that was unexpected. Every detained subject in the history of this facility has shown elevated cortisol indicators throughout the detention period, especially subjects facing execution. The biological stress response does not allow for full sleep cycles under those conditions." He paused. "Every detained subject until now." What did the academic community conclude? "Several things," he said. "Most of the conclusions involve the idea that your biology must be malfunctioning in some way, that you are perhaps not capable of properly processing the danger of your situation." I thought about this. "Do you believe that?" He was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to tell me he had been thinking about this since last night. "No," he said. "What do you believe?" "I believe," he said slowly, "that you processed the danger completely, and then you slept anyway." He picked up the tablet again. "I find I do not have a category for that." "Most people don't," I agreed. "Not at first." He made a notation, then looked up. "You asked me yesterday about the continuance provision." I did. I reported that conversation. I had assumed he would. I know. It was flagged as a curiosity, an unusual question. They concluded you were trying to identify a legal mechanism for appeal. "That's a reasonable conclusion," I said. "Is it accurate?" I met his eyes directly. which I now understood was technically a challenge, but which I also understood was the most honest form of communication I had available to me. Partly, I said. He held my gaze without flinching. Among the veil, direct eye contact returned was considered an acceptance of challenge, a refusal to back down. I suspected Vayan Keth was doing it because he wanted to understand me, and he had decided that understanding me was worth the social risk of the gesture. The execution is scheduled for mid-cycle, he said, in the Grand Court. It will be broadcast. I know. The princess herself will be present. I assumed she would be. Commander Voss, he said, and his voice had shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more careful. I have reviewed the Keth chain calibration specifications. They are set to Veil standard, which is higher than the standard for most of the 63 other species we have documented. He paused. Significantly higher than the standard we have calculated for human physiology, based on the biological scans taken upon your arrival. How significantly? Our estimate of your pain tolerance puts you at roughly 40% of Val standard, he said. The chains operate at full Veil standard. For a human, the subjective experience would be, he checked his tablet, catastrophically intense. Yes, I said, it would be. You would not survive 60 seconds. That's what the data says, I agreed. He was quiet. Then, but you believe you will. I did not answer that directly. Instead, I said, Vayan Keth, when your species first reached space, were there beings out there who told you what you were capable of? He considered. There were species who attempted to contain us. Yes. And what happened? His bioluminescence shifted slightly, something warm moving through the cool blue of it. We proved them wrong. Right, I said. Every species has a version of that story. The moment when someone else's certainty about your limits turned out to be less accurate than they thought. The Veil's version of it probably involved weapons or strategy, or some combination of the two. I leaned forward slightly. Ours involves something a little harder to quantify. He waited. Our limits, I said, are not where other species expect them to be. They never have been. And the gap between where our limits actually are and where other people think they are is the most consistently useful thing about us. He made a notation. Then he said something that surprised me. I put in a formal request this morning to be present at the execution, in an observational capacity. He did not look up from the tablet. It was granted. I did not thank him. Thanking him would have been strange, given the circumstances, but I noted it. A Veil scholar who could have spent the morning reviewing data from the safety of a comfortable office had instead asked to stand in the Grand Court and watch, because he was not certain anymore. That uncertainty was the most honest thing he could have given me. After he left, I spent an hour in careful physical preparation. I worked through a sequence of exercises that were not about strength or flexibility, but about proprioception, the body's awareness of itself, about giving the nervous system the best possible map of where it was in space, before asking it to do something extremely difficult. I worked my hands in particular, flexing and rotating, and pressing them against the floor with controlled, deliberate force, not because exercise would change anything about the chain's effect, but because the hands are where the chains would sit, and I wanted them fully present and awake when the moment came. I ate the nutrition paste. All of it. Fuel is fuel. I went through the mental discipline again. Not the sleep version, the active version, the one designed for high-load situations, the one that runs through the body's pain-signaling pathways and establishes, at a level below conscious thought, a kind of quiet authority over the panic response. It does not eliminate pain. Nothing eliminates pain except damage to the nervous system itself. What it does is establish a relationship between the conscious mind and the pain signal, one where the pain is heard and acknowledged, and then set aside like a document that has been read and filed. I had practiced this routine for 15 years. I had practiced it in cold water tanks, and in pressure chambers, and in training scenarios designed to produce exactly the kind of overwhelming physical experience that the body wants to flee. I had never practiced it against alien technology, but the nervous system does not particularly care what is producing the pain signal. It cares about the response. The response was mine. The guards came at mid-cycle. There were 4 of them, The same crystalline composure as every other veil I had encountered, efficient and certain, and carrying the particular energy of beings who are performing a well-established function they have performed many times before. They did not use the Keth chains for transport. They used a field restraint that limited my movement without causing pain, a practical choice that I suspected said something interesting about veil values. They caused discomfort where necessary, and not where it was unnecessary. There was an ethics to their efficiency, even if the broader situation was something I disagreed with entirely. The corridor from the detention block to the court was long. I counted my steps, counted the doors, counted the guards I passed, and the positions of the surveillance systems. Not because any of that information was likely to be useful today, but because counting is grounding. It keeps the mind engaged in the present, rather than racing ahead to the moment of confrontation. When the doors of the Grand Court opened, I heard the sound of 200 veil in the expectant silence they do instead of noise, and I walked through. The court was more overwhelming in person than it had been during the arrest. The scale of it registered differently when I was walking the full length of the floor toward the center, with the tiered seating rising on both sides, and the crystalline lamps burning above, and the obsidian floor reflecting everything back in deep, dark mirror images. My footsteps made no sound that I could hear. The restraint field kept my arms at my sides in a way that felt deliberate, designed to make me appear smaller, less capable of agency. I walked straight, shoulders back, chin level. One of the guards said something in veil that my earpiece translated as a directive to stop. I stopped. In the center of the court, a raised platform of the same obsidian as the floor held a single point of focus. The Keth chain activation node, I understood, was built into the platform itself. The chains would appear when I stepped onto it. The dissolution would begin. The princess descended from her throne. I watched her come down. I watched the way the court watched her, with that particular reverence that I had seen humans direct at very few people in my life. The kind of reverence that is not performed, but is simply there, because something inside the watching person recognizes something in the watched person as genuinely extraordinary. Whatever else Sailvain was, she commanded that response not through fear but through presence, and that said something about her that I filed away carefully. She stopped in front of me. She studied me. I had the cut above my eye from before, the dried blood still at my temple, the 3-day worn uniform. I looked exactly as I had looked when they had first brought me here, except that I had slept, and I suspected that was visible somewhere in me, in a way she had not expected. "You'll be dead in a minute, human," she said. The court chimed. I smiled. The guards removed the restraint field. The restraint field's absence was so immediate and physical that I felt the air around my arms differently, felt the full weight of my own body settle back into itself, without the field's subtle dampening. I stepped onto the platform. The Keth chains appeared. The pain was immediate and comprehensive, not sharp the way a cut is sharp, or a burn is sharp. Comprehensive, the way weather is comprehensive, present in every direction, no angle of the body outside it. It began at the wrists, exactly as before during the brief arrest, and it moved inward along the nerve pathways of my forearms with a speed and thoroughness that told me the calibration was working exactly as designed. At Veil standard. My jaw locked. My breathing changed to the combat pattern automatically, the pattern that was muscle memory by now, short and controlled and deliberate. In the first 5 seconds, the pain was the loudest thing in the world, louder than the silence of the court, louder than the sound of my own heartbeat, an unbroken signal demanding that everything stop. I did not let everything stop. I picked a point on the far wall of the court, a specific point, where 2 panels met and a hairline seam ran vertically for about half a meter. I fixed my attention on that seam, and I held it there with the kind of focus that you develop when someone is firing things at you, and you need to be precisely somewhere specific in your mind, rather than scattered across the experience of being fired at. 10 seconds. My hands were shaking. Not because I was losing control of them, but because the dissolution process was affecting the muscular tissue as it worked outward from the chain's contact point, and involuntary muscle response was the predictable result of that. My hands were shaking and my forearms were shaking, and I was standing upright with my focus on a seam in the wall of an alien court, and I was breathing in and out in the pattern, and I was still there. I was aware, at the edge of my attention, of the court. The silence that had been satisfied and certain when I entered had become something else. Not loud. The veil did not become loud in surprise, but the quality of the silence had changed. The certainty had left it. 20 seconds. This was the point at which, Vayenketh had told me, the biological monitors showed incapacitation beginning in the documented subjects. 20 seconds in. Cognitive function declining. Biological systems beginning to withdraw resources from non-essential processes. I thought about my crew. 41 people on this station in a detention bay somewhere. People who had followed me through a navigation failure, and a diplomatic catastrophe, and an alien arrest, and who were sitting right now, in whatever space they had been given, waiting. People with families and ambitions and years ahead of them, and specific, irreplaceable ways of being in the world that no one else could replicate. Priya, who could manage 3 communication channels simultaneously, without losing the thread of any of them. Dara, who could hear an engine anomaly before the sensors logged it. Yemi, who made coffee at 0400 when the night watch needed it most and never mentioned that he had done it. Callum, who had held Ensign Farida Osei's hand for 4 hours during the Korath mission when she was injured and waiting for medical support, just held it, because that was what she needed. 41 people. I would not let 41 people become the crew of the commander who failed them. 30 seconds. The pain was doing something now that was harder to describe than the initial rush of it. It was becoming a kind of pressure, like the pressure of depth underwater, present everywhere and threatening to become all-consuming if I let my attention sink into it, rather than stay above it. The comparison is imperfect, but the mechanism is the same. You can be overwhelmed by either one if you let yourself go under. You stay above it by finding something else to put your mind on, something external, something that exists outside the experience. The seam on the wall, 1/2 meter, vertical, hairline, still there. 35 seconds. I heard something that was not quite a sound in the court, a shift, the kind of collective adjustment that happens in a large group of beings when something is not going the way it was supposed to go, and no one has the script for what comes next. 40 seconds. My legs were steady. This surprised me slightly, because I had half expected the dissolution to affect my lower body through the nerve pathways by now, some sympathetic response traveling further than the arms. It had not. The chains were precise, working the defined area with the defined intensity, thorough but contained. The veil were efficient. Efficiency, in this case, was working in my favor. 45 seconds. I took my eyes off the seam in the wall. I looked at the princess. She was standing 12 meters away, where she had moved after delivering her sentence, and she was very still in the way she had been still when Dara whistled, except that this time the stillness was not cold. I could see the bioluminescence at her jaw flickering rapidly, a series of small, quick pulses that I could not yet read, but that clearly meant something intense was happening in whatever part of her nervous system processed unexpected information. Her eyes were fixed on me. I held her gaze. 50 seconds. The chains were at their maximum dissolution cycle. I could tell because the character of the pain shifted slightly, reaching a plateau rather than an increase, and because I could feel, at the very edges of the affected area, a slight cooling that told me the process was reaching the outer boundary of its operational parameters. The veil built precise tools. The tool was running out of designed runway. 55 seconds. I unclenched my jaw. This required deliberate effort. I was aware that my face was not composed in any conventional sense. I was not performing calm. I was not acting. I was sweating through my uniform and my hands were raw, and my arms felt like they belonged to someone else. I was not okay in any physiological sense. But I was conscious. I was standing. And I had something that I wanted to say. 60 seconds. The Keth chains completed their cycle and disengaged. The court was so silent that I could hear the faint sound of the crystalline lamps above, a low, continuous tone that had probably been there the whole time, but that I was only now able to register because everything else in the room had stopped. I lowered my arms. I looked at my hands. The skin was red and raw, with a quality to it that would leave marks for several days. My wrists would be uncomfortable for a while. The damage was real and visible, and would be sore to touch for some time. I was otherwise intact. I raised my eyes to the princess. She had not moved. I took one step forward, then another. My legs held. I believe, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended but steady. Under Article 9 of the Continuance Provision, we need to talk. The silence lasted 2 full seconds. Then someone in the court made a sound. It was not the chime of approval. I had never heard a veil make a sound like this before. It was short and sharp, and it came from one being, and then from several, and then it spread through the court, like water finding the edges of a surface. Not loud, not panicked, but unmistakable. It was the sound of a certainty breaking. The princess looked at me across 12 meters of obsidian floor. And for the first time since I had seen her, she was not performing anything. She was just there, real and present, and trying to understand something that her entire life's experience had not prepared her to understand. I waited. The broadcast to 17 star systems was still running. I had a feeling that what came next was going to matter. Nobody moved for a very long time. I stood in the center of the platform with the raw weight of 60 seconds pressing into every nerve in my arms, feeling the platform under my feet and the air on my face, and the deep, ongoing fact of being alive with the particular clarity that follows something that should not have worked but did. The overhead lamps hummed their low, continuous tone. 200 veils sat or stood in their tiered positions and did not make any sound I recognized as purposeful. The princess stood 12 meters away and looked at me with an expression I was only beginning to have the vocabulary to read. Then one of her advisors moved. He came from the left side of the court, from a position close to the throne platform, with the rapid, controlled movement of someone responding to an emergency protocol. He reached the princess in seconds, leaned close, and spoke in veil too quickly for my earpiece to catch more than fragments. I caught the word for law. I caught something that sounded like a term for precedent, and I caught, very clearly, a word that the Matrix rendered as impossible. The princess did not respond to him immediately. She was still looking at me. After a moment, she raised one hand slightly, a gesture that the advisor clearly recognized as dismissal, because he straightened immediately and stepped back. She said, in standard, Article 9 of the Continuance Provision has not been invoked in this court in recorded memory. I understand, I said. You researched it. I asked about it, I said. There's a difference. Her bioluminescence flickered at the jaw, a quick pulse, and then a slow one. Why? Because I needed to know what the rules were. When you're somewhere unfamiliar and the stakes are high, knowing the rules is the first useful thing you can do. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you knew you would survive. I believed I would survive, I said. I did not know. There is a difference there too. The difference between knowledge and belief. Between certainty and commitment, I said. Something shifted in her face. The bioluminescence steadied, which I was beginning to understand as the veil equivalent of a deep breath, a settling of the self. She looked at me for another long moment. Then she looked at her court. What she said in veil was long and formal, and my earpiece caught about 70% of it through the speed and the ceremonial register. The core of it was that the continuance provision applied, that the condemned prisoner had survived the execution, that the law was clear, that the prisoner was released from the execution sentence. The court's response was the closest thing to silence that 200 beings could produce, while clearly having strong opinions about what they were hearing. One of the senior advisors, a tall veil with more crystalline markers than anyone else in the room except the princess, stepped forward from the elevated seating and spoke. My earpiece struggled with his accent, which was more formal and archaic than the princess's, but I caught the substance of it. He was arguing that the provision's intent had never contemplated a being with the specific physiological differences that might constitute a technical, rather than a genuine survival, that the spirit of the continuance provision applied to veil law for veil beings, that applying it to a foreign species exceeded the provision's scope. He spoke for some time. His voice was measured and confident, and carried the particular authority of someone who has been the expert in the room for many years. When he finished, the princess turned to me. Lord Vaensal argues that the continuance provision was not designed to apply to species outside the sovereignty, she said, that your survival, while biologically genuine, falls outside the legal intent of the law. I understand the argument, I said. Do you have a response? I have a question, I said. Does the continuance provision anywhere specify that it applies only to veil physiology? A pause. No, she said. Does it anywhere specify the species of the condemned? Another pause, and this one was longer. No, she said again. Then the law applies to whoever survives, I said. That was the law's intent, not to protect the familiar, to recognize the genuine. Lord Van Sol spoke again, sharply this time. I did not need the earpiece to read his tone. He was not happy. The princess listened. She looked at Lord Van Sol with the composed attention of someone who is hearing an argument they have already privately evaluated. She let him finish. Then she said something brief in Vale that was rendered by my earpiece as, "The law is the law." And that was the end of that argument. Lord Van Sol returned to his position with the controlled movement of someone who is extremely displeased, and has decided that displaying that displeasure beyond a certain point would be beneath his station. He sat down. He did not look at me. The princess came toward me. She stopped 2 meters away, close enough to speak at normal volume, far enough to be deliberate about the distance, to show that she was choosing it. "What? You are released from the execution sentence, under the terms of the continuance provision," she said, formally. "The Keth debt is acknowledged. Thank you," I said. She studied my face. "I need to understand what you are. You're not the first person to ask me that today," I said. Something in her expression shifted, not quite amusement. The Vale equivalent of noting something unexpected and finding it interesting, rather than threatening. "You spoke with Vayan Keth. He visited me in detention," I said. "We had several good conversations. He reported them. I assumed he would." "He also," she said, "included a notation in his report that reads, in full, I recommend caution in any assumption that our existing behavioral models apply to this species. I believe the models are inadequate." She paused. Vayan Keth has not used the word inadequate in 20 years of academic documentation. "He's a careful person," I said. "Careful people update their models when the evidence changes." She was looking at me with an intensity that was completely different from the contempt she had carried during the arrest and the execution sentence. This was something else. Something I recognized, even across the vast biological distance between us, as genuine attention. "Your crew," she said. "They will be released." "When?" "Now." She turned to an attendant near the base of the throne platform and gave a brief instruction. Then she turned back. "This conversation will continue in private, not here." She gestured toward the court, where 200 beings were still present, and the broadcast was still running. "The public record ends here. The rest is between us." I looked at the court. I looked at the broadcast array mounted high on the far wall, the crystalline apparatus that I knew was carrying this entire event to 17 star systems across Vale space. "I have no objection to privacy," I said. "But I want to be clear about something first, while the broadcast is still running." Her expression sharpened. "Go on." I turned slightly, so that I was facing the broadcast array more directly. I was not performing this. I was not being dramatic. I was making a deliberate choice about what the 17 star systems watching this moment needed to hear. "My name is Commander Ilara Voss," I said. "I represent the Terran Interstellar Council, and 400 billion human beings who would very much like to be a part of this galaxy's conversation. We made a mistake arriving here the way we did. A navigation failure is not an excuse, but it is an explanation, and it is the truth. We came with the intention of introduction, not confrontation." I paused. "We are still here with that intention, and we are prepared to talk about everything, including the 17 probes sent toward your boundary beacon 8 years ago, and whether those probes were truly unmanned." The princess went very still. I looked at her directly. Was the broadcast still running for that? "Yes," she said, very quietly. "Good," I said. I turned away from the broadcast array. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that carried no anger in it, but a great deal of weight, "Deactivate the broadcast." The crystalline array went dark. She did not speak for another 10 seconds. Then, "You knew about the probes." "We knew they stopped sending data," I said. "We had no confirmation of what happened to them. We suspected. The Council's assessment was that they had been intercepted. The question of whether they were intercepted as unmanned technology or as crewed vessels was one we could not answer from our side." "They were crewed," she said. The words landed with exactly the weight I had expected them to have, which was the weight of something that had been sitting unconfirmed for 8 years, and was now, suddenly, confirmed. "How many?" I asked. 23, she said, "across the 17 vessels." I held that number for a moment without saying anything. 23 people. 23 people who had gone into the dark in small probe craft on a mission of curiosity and discovery, and had not come back, and whose families had been told for 8 years only that they were missing in deep space during an exploratory mission. "Did they know where they were going?" I asked. "They broadcast a designation code when our ships intercepted them. We were unable to translate it at the time. We did not know they were crewed vessels." Her voice carried something in it that was not quite what I would call regret, in the veil sense, but was clearly not nothing. "We believed them to be automated monitoring technology. When they were disabled and found to carry biological remains, we understood we had made an error." "What did you do with that information?" "We classified it," she said. "A classified error is an error contained. An acknowledged error is an error with consequences." "Yes," I said, "it is." She looked at me. "You said those words in front of 17 star systems." "I did. You knew what you were doing. I knew that whatever happens in this conversation, the people watching that broadcast would know those probes existed, and that we asked about them. Which means a complete denial or a permanent concealment becomes significantly harder." I kept my voice even. "I wasn't trying to corner you. I was trying to create a situation where the honest conversation was easier than the alternative." She was quiet for a long moment. Around us, the court was still full of Vale who had heard everything, who were now processing everything, whose own relationship to this event was shifting in real time as they sat with what they had just watched. "I will clear the court," she said. She gave the instruction. It was brief and formal, and the court began to empty in the efficient, orderly way that everything in Vale culture appeared to operate. No confusion, no jostling. 200 beings filing out through the designated exits with the calm precision of a society that had never needed to improvise much of anything. Lord Vayan's soul was the last to leave. He paused at the exit and looked back at the princess. A look that carried something in it I could not fully read, but that felt like concern rather than disapproval. She met his gaze for a moment and gave a small nod. He left. And then the vast grand court of the Vale sovereignty was occupied by exactly 2 beings. One of them was me. The other was the most powerful person in one of the galaxy's oldest civilizations, standing on obsidian floors under crystalline light, looking at me with an expression that I could now read with enough confidence to name. She was not angry. She was trying to figure out what to do next with a situation that nothing in her long life had prepared her for. That made 2 of us. "My chambers," she said. "We will speak privately." "I'd like my crew to be somewhere I can reach them," I said. "Not necessarily present for our conversation, just reachable." "They will be housed in the diplomatic quarters," she said. "You may communicate with them after our meeting." It was not what I had asked for, but it was movement in the right direction. "That's acceptable," I said. She began to move toward the side exit of the court, the one that led to the private wings of the station. She did not look back to see if I was following. I followed. My arms still ached from the wrists to the shoulders. My skin was tender in a way that would take several days to resolve. I was running on 4 hours of sleep and nutrition paste, and the particular, crackling energy of someone who has just done something that shouldn't have been possible and is still slightly amazed to be upright. I followed the princess of the Vale sovereignty through a corridor of crystalline architecture that was designed to express permanence and authority in every dimension. High ceilings, smooth surfaces, perfect proportions. And I thought about the fact that 10 minutes ago I had been standing on a platform with alien chains on my wrists, and now I was being led to a private conversation with the sovereign of a civilization that had been in space for longer than my species had been writing things down. Harlan Cross would have had something to say about this. Probably. "Voss, what did you do now?" And I would have said, "I'm working on it, sir." And he would have said, "You always are." The corridor opened into a chamber that was smaller than the court but no less considered. Bookshelves, or their Vale equivalent, lined the walls. Thin crystal slabs arranged in careful rows, each one containing something that my instincts read as stored information, even though I could not interact with it. A long surface of pale stone served as a table, with 2 low seats on one side and space on the other. The princess did not sit. She stood at the far end of the table and turned to face me. "I am going to ask you something," she said, "and I want an honest answer." "All right," I said. "How many more of you are there?" I understood the question. Not how many humans. How many humans who would do what I had just done, who would walk onto that platform and refuse to accept the outcome everyone else had already written for them. "All of us," I said, "potentially. The training varies, the application varies, the willingness varies, but the underlying capacity is not rare. It is a baseline." She was very still. "You're saying," she said slowly, "that what I watched today is not exceptional for your species." "It is unusual," I said carefully, "in the sense that most humans never find themselves in circumstances that require it. But the capacity is there in most of us. It's part of what we are." "How?" she asked. And it was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. "How does a species develop that capacity?" "By nearly not making it," I said, "over and over and over again, and still making it anyway." She looked at me for a long time. "I owe you a Keth debt," she said finally. "You do," I said. "I also owe your species an explanation for 23 deaths." "You do," I said again. "And your council is going to want both things addressed." "They will," I said. "But the Keth debt and the 23 deaths are not the most important thing on my agenda right now." She raised an eyebrow, which was a gesture so recognizably universal that it almost made me smile. "What is?" "The 4 other species I saw watching that broadcast array at the moment it deactivated," I said. She went completely still. "There were Veil in this room from 17 systems," I said, "but the broadcast array architecture I could see from the platform had more than 17 routing channels. It had 22, and 5 of those extra channels had active reception confirmation lights that were different from the Veil ones. A different color, a different rhythm." I met her eyes. Someone else was watching. Someone you haven't mentioned. The bioluminescence along her jaw did something I had not seen it do before. It went dark entirely, for just a moment, then returned. A sharp, controlled response. "You counted the lights on the broadcast array," she said, "while you were on the platform." "I had 60 seconds, I said. "I wasn't doing anything else useful." She stared at me. And then, for the first time, something crossed her face that was unmistakably similar to a human response, so similar that it crossed the biological distance between us, without translation, without interpretation, without any need for a cultural key. She almost smiled. "Sit down, Commander Voss," she said. "This conversation is going to take a while." I sat. Outside the chamber, beyond the walls of the station, the stars of a galaxy that had spent 11,000 years being certain about things were quietly adjusting their certainty. It had taken 60 seconds. 60 seconds, and a smile, and a hand extended in a space that didn't know what to do with it. And we were just getting started. The princess's private chamber had no windows. I noticed this because I would have expected the most powerful being in the sovereignty to have access to the best view the station offered, and the station was in orbit around one of the most visually striking planets I had seen in 6 years of deep space service. Vinos Prime from orbit was a world of deep greens and pale golds, with cloud formations that moved in slow, magnificent spirals visible from this altitude. It was extraordinary, and she had designed her working space to face inward, all walls, all crystal and stone, and stored information, nothing outward facing. I thought about what that said about a person, about a leader, someone who had chosen to make decisions without the view, without the constant reminder of what was at stake below, because the reminder was not something she needed. She carried it internally. I filed that away. We had been in the chamber for an hour. In that hour, I had learned 3 things that I had not known before. The first was that the 5 extra broadcast channels on the array were receiving feeds to what the princess called observer civilizations, species that existed in loose diplomatic relation to the sovereignty, but were not members of it, that received information from Veil space through formal broadcast agreements, rather than through direct contact. They watched, they noted. They did not intervene in Veil affairs. It was a sophisticated system of controlled transparency, allowing the Veil to project power and information simultaneously, while maintaining complete sovereignty over how that information was framed. Until today, when the human from the execution platform had survived, and then pointed out the existence of 5 channels they were not supposed to know about. The second thing I learned was that the Veil had been aware of human deep space activity for longer than 8 years, 14 years. The 17 probes we had thought were our first meaningful push toward their space had been the 7th wave of human signals they had detected. The previous 6 waves had been unmanned, passive sensors, nothing they considered worth formally addressing, but they had been watching us for longer than we had known we were watched. The third thing was the one that mattered most. "Tell me about the Korath," the princess said. She said it without preamble, between 2 other topics, in the way that someone asks a question they have been holding since before the conversation started. I looked at her. "What do you know about the Korath?" "We know they made contact with your species approximately 9 years ago," she said. "We know the contact was hostile. We know there was an extended engagement." She paused. "We know the Korath no longer engage in deep space operations." "That's accurate," I said. "Why?" I considered how to explain the Korath situation in a way that was honest, without being either boastful or minimizing. The Korath had been our first genuinely violent first contact. A species of formidable intelligence and aggressive territorial expansion that had responded to the arrival of a human exploratory vessel, not with communication, but with an attack that destroyed the vessel and all 12 people aboard. The Terran Interstellar Council had spent 4 months debating the appropriate response. The debate had ended when 2 more human vessels were destroyed. "They initiated a series of attacks on our vessels," I said. "We responded."
How?
"First, with attempts at communication. We broadcast on every frequency we could manage. We sent probes ahead of any crewed approach. We tried for 8 months to find a way to reach them that didn't involve further engagement." I paused. "They destroyed the probes. And then?" "And then we adapted," I said. The princess looked at me with steady attention. "What does adapted mean, in this context?" "It means we studied what they were doing, and we found the parts of it that didn't work against us, and we built around those parts, and we kept responding until the situation changed." I kept my voice factual, not aggressive. "The Korath operated on the assumption that sufficient damage would produce withdrawal, that if they made the cost of staying high enough, we would leave." "That is a rational assumption," she said. "It works with most species." "It does," I agreed. "Most species have a threshold at which the cost outweighs the reason for staying. We have that threshold too. But what the Korath didn't account for was that our reason for staying wasn't resources or territorial claim. It was the 12 people they had killed and the ships they had destroyed. And our response to losing people is not to calculate whether the cost of continuing is acceptable." "What is your response?" "To make absolutely certain it doesn't happen again," I said. She absorbed this. "They withdrew from deep space. They withdrew from a significant portion of their former operational range," I said. "We didn't pursue them into their sovereign territory. That was never the objective. The objective was to establish, clearly and without ambiguity, that attacking human vessels was not a viable long-term strategy. Once that was established, we stopped." "You stopped," she said, "when you had the advantage. When the objective was achieved," I said. "We're not interested in conquest. We're interested in being able to move through the galaxy without being destroyed." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I had not expected. "The Korath sent a communication to the Sovereignty 6 years ago." I went very still. "What kind of communication?" "An advisory." Her voice was measured. "They described your species. They described the engagement. They recommended that the Sovereignty avoid contact." She paused. "They used a specific phrase to describe humans that we have no direct equivalent for in standard. The closest translation would be something like, a species that does not acknowledge the concept of a concluded situation." I thought about that phrase for a moment. They meant that we don't accept when a fight is over. That is how we interpreted it. "That's not quite right," I said slowly. "We accept when a fight is over. We're very capable of recognizing an ending. What we don't accept is when someone else decides the ending before we do. When the ending is imposed rather than reached. Is there a difference?" "A very large one," I said. "If you and I reach the end of a conflict together, through negotiation or through mutual exhaustion, or through the recognition that continuing serves neither of us, I will honor that ending completely. But if you simply decide that you have won, and that the situation is resolved on your terms, without any reference to what I think about it, I will keep looking for a way to make it not resolved, until the terms are ones that both of us can actually live with. She was quiet for a long time. The 23 deaths, she said finally. Yes. We decided the situation was resolved, she said. We classified the error. We maintained the classification. And we kept sending probes, I said. And then we sent a diplomatic vessel. And then the diplomatic vessel ended up here. A navigation failure. A navigation failure, I agreed. Which tells you something about how we operate. We didn't stop looking just because the looking was dangerous. We just kept sending different things until something got through. She rose from her seat and walked to the far wall, the one with the stored crystal slabs arranged in their careful rows. She stood with her back to me for a moment, and I watched the bioluminescence at her jaw and hands run through a complex sequence that I could not read, but recognized as significant. When she turned back, her expression was one I could now identify with some confidence as decision, rather than deliberation. I want to show you something, she said. She went to the wall and withdrew one of the crystal slabs, holding it in both hands, then placed it on the table between us. It projected a display when she touched a specific point, light rising from the surface and forming a three-dimensional map. It was the galaxy, or at least a significant portion of it, the veil portion. Hundreds of settled systems rendered in cool blue light, connected by lines that indicated travel routes, grouped into regions that indicated administrative divisions. It was a map of a civilization that had been building itself for tens of thousands of years. This is the sovereignty, she said. It's remarkable, I said. I meant it. This is what we protect. She touched a point at the outer edge of the sovereignty's mapped territory, and this is where your probes first appeared. The point she indicated was on the near edge of the veil space, close to the boundary where our navigation failure had dropped us, 14 years ago. The first human signals they had detected. You were watching us for 14 years, I said. We were monitoring signals that came from your direction, she said. Whether we were watching you specifically implies more targeted attention than we initially gave. She paused. That changed approximately 6 years ago, when the Korath sent their advisory. Yes. She touched another point on the map, further from the Veil core systems. At that point, we began dedicated monitoring of your activity. We mapped your known systems. We tracked your expansion trajectory. She moved her finger along a projected line that extended from human space toward Veil space, showing the historical path of our exploratory pushes. You were moving in our direction with a consistency and a speed that was not typical. We explore, I said. All spacefaring species explore to some extent, she said. What is not typical is the rate, the persistence, the degree to which setbacks failed to redirect your trajectory. She looked at the map. When we disabled your probes and received no response, other species stopped sending probes to that region. You sent different probes. We wanted to know what was out there. You knew something was stopping your probes. Yes. And you kept going, she said. Yes. She looked at me directly. Do you understand how that reads from our position? A species that knows an unknown power, is destroying its technology in a specific region, and continues to send technology into that region? It reads as dangerously curious, I said. It reads as dangerously committed, she said. Curious beings stop when the curiosity becomes costly. Committed beings do not stop. I thought about how to respond to this. You're not wrong, I said finally. We are committed beings. The question is what we're committed to, and what we've been committed to, in the direction of your space, is contact, not conflict, not territory, contact, the ability to meet whatever is out there and begin the conversation. Even if what is out there destroys your technology and kills your people. Even then, I said, because the alternative is not knowing, and for us, not knowing is its own kind of cost. She looked at the map for a long moment. Then she said, the 5 observer civilizations who are watching the broadcast today. Yes. One of them will reach out to your government within 48 hours, she said. Not to the Terran Interstellar Council specifically, to whatever communication channel they can identify as human-operated. I sat with the implications of that for a moment. Why? Because they watched what happened in the Grand Court today, she said, and they have spent many years making their own assessments of the Vale sovereignty's permanence as the dominant power in this region. She paused. Today's events will cause several of them to update those assessments. You're telling me this, I said slowly, as a warning. I'm telling you this, she said, as information that you will use more wisely if I give it to you than if you discover it without context. I looked at her. That's a significant shift from where we were 2 hours ago. 2 hours ago you were scheduled for execution, she said. Situations change. They do, I said, often faster than the systems designed to manage them. Something in her expression softened, minimally, in the way that things soften when a person decides to let down a small, specific portion of what they carry. It was not vulnerability exactly. It was something closer to accuracy, choosing to be precisely what one is, rather than the elevated, composed version that public positions require. I made decisions based on what I was told you were, she said. I know. The files on your species were inadequate. Vayenketh said as much, I said. He's a good scholar. He is, she agreed. He is also currently writing a report that I expect will be extremely long, and will recommend a complete restructuring of how we document and assess first contact scenarios with species we have not previously encountered. She paused. He included a personal note in his preliminary findings. He asked to be assigned to any future human contact missions in an advisory capacity. I felt something warm and straightforward move through me. Vayenketh, with his crystal tablet and his careful notations, and his willingness to update his models when the evidence changed. I'm glad, I said. He said, the princess continued, with something in her voice that I was almost certain was the closest thing to dry amusement that her species produced, and I quote, I have studied foreign species for 20 years, and have learned a great deal about them. Commander Voss is the first subject who appeared to be studying me back with equal intent. This is either a profound indicator of intellectual parity, or an unusual individual. I intend to find out which. I laughed. It was a real laugh, not performed, not careful, the kind that comes out when something genuinely lands. The princess watched me laugh, and I could see her processing it, this involuntary human sound, the way it moved through the body, the way it was produced by something genuine rather than constructed. She had probably never heard a human laugh before. It is not a quiet sound when it is real. After it passed, she said, You do that often. Laugh? When something is funny, yes. In a situation like this. Especially in a situation like this, I said. Situations like this tend to produce either the best or the worst of a person. When something lands exactly right in the middle of it, laughing is the honest response. She was quiet. Then, we don't do that. Laugh? We have an equivalent response to something satisfying or unexpected in a pleasant way, she said. But it is private, internal, not expressed outward. That sounds lonely, I said, before I had quite decided to say it. She looked at me for a long moment. It is sometimes, she said, and from the slight quality of her voice when she said it, from the way the bioluminescence at her jaw shifted into something slower and more private, I understood that this was not a diplomatic answer. It was a real one, something that had been true and had not been said, finding an unexpected exit. I did not make anything of it. I let it sit the way real things deserve to sit, without being turned into an advantage or a conversational tactic. The Keth debt, I said, after a moment. Yes. I don't want material restitution, I said. She raised that single eyebrow again. What do you want? A formal acknowledgement of the 23 deaths, I said. In writing, with your signature, addressed to the Terran Interstellar Council. What they do with that acknowledgement after they receive it is their decision, but they will receive it. And a formal diplomatic agreement, not a treaty. We're not ready for a full treaty, neither of us. But an agreement that establishes that human vessels operating in good faith are not subject to immediate hostile response. A channel for communication. A way to talk before either side does something both sides will regret. She was quiet. And, I said, I would like to know what happened to the remains of the 23. She held my gaze. We preserved them, she said. When we understood they were biological, we preserved them. We did not know what to do with them. They are in containment. I would like to bring them home, I said. She nodded. Once, slowly, with a weight to it that had nothing diplomatic in it, just the simple acknowledgement of one sovereign to another, that the dead deserved to go home. Done, she said. Thank you, I said. Outside the chamber, somewhere on this station, 41 members of my crew were being moved to diplomatic quarters. I would talk to them soon. I would see Priya's face, and Dara's face, and Yemi's face, and Callum's face, and all the others, and I would know by looking at them that we had come through something that had no business being survived. And in the morning, I would begin the work of building something real. Not because it was easy, not because I was certain of the outcome, but because that is what you do when you are still breathing. You build. The diplomatic quarters were not what I expected. I had been imagining something functional and neutral, the interstellar equivalent of a business hotel, adequate and deliberate in its adequacy. What I found instead, when an attendant led me through a series of corridors that gradually became lighter and warmer in their materials, was a set of connected rooms that had been furnished with what I could only describe as careful attention to detail. Not human detail. The furniture was sized wrong, the proportions all slightly off in ways that told me it had been designed for the standard Vale body and adjusted to accommodate something smaller. The light was a touch too blue. The temperature was on the cool side of comfortable. But there were elements in the room that had required someone to think about what might make a foreign being feel less like a specimen and more like a guest. A surface at human table height. Covered containers that, when I opened one, held a selection of food items that included several proteins I recognized from their molecular composition as Earth-adjacent, clearly obtained through analysis of what my ship's stores had contained. Someone had done their homework. I suspected that someone was Vayan Keth. My crew arrived 20 minutes later, in 2 groups, led by a pair of Vale attendants who moved with the efficient courtesy I was coming to recognize as the standard Vale professional manner. I was standing in the central room when they came through the door, and the moment I saw Priya's face, I understood what a profound physical relief it is to look at familiar people after a period of sustained uncertainty. She looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has been holding themselves together through an exercise of will, and is now, finally, in a position to briefly not hold together. Her eyes filled. She blinked it away in one clean motion. "Commander," she said. "Lieutenant Nair," I said. We did not embrace. We were professional people in a situation that was still, technically, a diplomatic incident. But she held my gaze for a moment, that communicated everything that 2 people who have worked together through a crisis communicate when they look at each other from the other side of it. Dara came through next, and her assessment was more practical and immediate. She walked the perimeter of the room in under 30 seconds, checked the atmospheric reading on a small personal sensor she always carried, tasted the air with the satisfied expression of an engineer who has confirmed a specification, and then looked at me. "You're in one piece," she said. "More or less," I said. "Your wrists," she said, "because Dara notices things." "Healing," I said. "Nothing permanent." "Callum will look at them." "I know he will," I said. Yemi came through with 3 others, and his face, when he saw me, did the thing that Yemi's face sometimes did, where a lot of emotion ran through it very quickly and came out the other side as a small, contained expression that said everything without requiring words. He nodded once. I nodded back. Callum, as predicted, had his medical kit open before he finished crossing the room. "Arms," he said, not as a question. "Later," I said. "I need to speak to everyone first." He gave me the specific look of a medic who is being deferred to for professional reasons, and is not happy about it, but recognizes it as the right call. "Immediately after," he said. "Immediately after," I agreed. I gathered my crew, all 41 of them, in a room that was slightly too large for 41 humans, and still somehow felt like the most comfortable space I had been in for the past 72 hours. I told them what had happened, from the arrest, to the execution, to the private meeting with the princess. I told them clearly, and without softening anything. They were my crew. They had a right to the full picture. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Yemi said, "The chains just stopped?" "After 60 seconds, I said. "Automatic safety cycle limit." And you held on for 60 seconds. I did. He absorbed this. Then he said, in the tone of someone filing a report rather than expressing an emotion, "That is an extremely Voss thing to do." Several people made sounds that were not quite laughs, but were in that general vicinity. After the briefing, I found a space in the corner of the room and sat against the wall and let Callum do his work on my wrists, which were sore and red and would have been significantly more than that if the chains had operated at anything beyond their 60-second cycle. He applied a topical regenerative compound and wrapped both wrists in thin medical film, working with the precise economy of a medic who has dealt with worse in stranger places. "You should have told me what you were planning," he said, quietly, so the others wouldn't hear. "I didn't know if it was going to work," I said. "That's exactly why you should have told me," he said. "I'm the person who's supposed to be ready for when things go wrong." "If it had gone wrong, there was nothing you could have done," I said gently. He did not argue this. He finished the second wrist and sat back. "The 23, he said. "Yes." "They're going to come home." "Yes." He sat with that for a moment. He had lost a friend on one of those probes. I knew this because I knew my crew, the way you know people when you have lived and worked in close quarters for years, their habits and their histories and the things they carry, without talking about them. He had never mentioned it, but I knew. He had applied for this mission himself, specifically this mission, which was the first TIC-approved deep push toward the space where the probes had disappeared. He looked down at his hands. "Thank you, Commander," he said. "Don't thank me yet," I said. "We still have a lot of work to do." "I know," he said, "but thank you anyway." I left him there and found a spot where I could contact the Resolute. The ship had been taken into Vale custody but not damaged, which was information the Princess had given me, and which I had not been entirely certain to trust until I reached the ship's communication system through the channel the Vale attendant had set up in the diplomatic quarters. Lieutenant Arya Kimura was the officer I had left in command of the Resolute when the boarding party took me. Arya was 26 years old and had been on the Resolute for 18 months and had the kind of steadiness that some people are simply born with, and others develop over long years of being tested. She had kept the ship calm and functional during the 3 days of my detention. When she came on the communication channel, her voice was exactly as steady as I had expected it to be. "Commander," she said, "it's good to hear you." "It's good to be heard," I said. "Status." "Ship is intact and fully operational," she said. "They didn't touch the systems. They boarded and sealed us and left a monitoring buoy on the hull, but nothing internal has been accessed." She paused. We watched the broadcast. "All of it?" "All of it." A brief silence. "The crew here has some opinions," she said. "I imagine they do," I said. "Tell them from me that we'll debrief fully when we're back aboard. In the meantime, I need you to send a message to the Terran Interstellar Council. Priority transmission. I'm going to give you the full message now." I dictated it. Every relevant fact, in order, without editorializing. The navigation failure, the arrest, the execution attempt, the continuance provision, the meeting with the princess, the 23 deaths and the formal acknowledgement that was being prepared, the observer civilizations, and the advisory they would send within 48 hours, the diplomatic agreement that was under discussion. When I finished, Arya was quiet for a moment. "Commander," she said, "they're going to have a lot of questions." "I know," I said. "Tell them I'm aware, and that I'll submit a full report the moment I'm back on the ship. In the meantime, tell them that the situation is under control and that we are making progress." Another pause. "Are we?" "Yes," I said. "Real progress. Not the quick kind. The kind that lasts." She accepted this with the same steadiness she applied to everything. "There's one more thing," she said. 14 minutes after the broadcast went out, we received a signal. It was not from the Vale. It was on a frequency we don't use. It was short. She read it to me verbatim. It said, "We saw. We are interested. We will make contact in your space within 30 days. Please do not shoot first." I sat with this for a long moment. "Which observer civilization?" I asked. "We don't know," she said. "The frequency signature is unfamiliar to our library. Whatever sent it is outside our current documentation. Send that to the council as a separate annex," I said. "Tell them they should expect company." Yes, Commander. After I closed the channel, I sat in the quiet for a few minutes. The princess had told me that one of the observer civilizations would reach out. She had been right about the timeline. What she had apparently not anticipated was that they would reach out directly to the Resolute, rather than through standard Veil-mediated channels, which told me that at least one of the 5 watching species had monitoring technology good enough to locate a specific ship in Veil orbital space and aim a transmission at it. That was worth knowing. I went back to the main room where my crew was eating and talking, and doing the things people do when a sustained period of controlled stress has just, slightly, relaxed its grip. I found a seat near Priya and ate something from the covered containers and let the noise and the warmth of 41 people who were all alive and present work on the parts of me that had been running on pure function for 3 days. Priya said, quietly, while everyone else was talking around us, "The council is going to promote you." "The council is going to investigate every decision I made," I said. "And then they're going to promote you," she said. "We'll see," I said. "You survived an alien execution by sheer refusal to accept the premise of it," she said. "You identified a 5-channel secondary broadcast architecture by counting lights while chains were dissolving your skin, and then you negotiated a diplomatic agreement in the private chambers of a sovereign who had just tried to execute you." She paused. "They're going to promote you. Or court-martial me for unauthorized diplomatic engagement," I said. "Promotion," she said, with complete conviction. "I'll bet my commission on it." I did not argue further. That night, I slept in a Veil bed that was 2 sizes too large and positioned at the wrong angle for a human spine, and I slept well regardless, with the deep and uncomplicated quality of sleep that follows the completion of something genuinely difficult. In the morning, Vayan Keth came. He arrived at the diplomatic quarters at what I was coming to understand as his standard working hour, with his crystal tablet and his careful, forward attention, and the faint green-blue of his bioluminescence, slightly warmer than it had been in the detention cell. He was different here, in a space that was intended for conversation rather than observation. Less observational distance, more present. "The preliminary agreement is drafted," he said. "The princess has reviewed it. She is asking if you are available to sign it this morning." "I'm available," I said. "There is one addition she made in the final draft," he said. He looked at his tablet. "It reads, 'This agreement is entered into in recognition that the Terran Interstellar Council and its representative commander Elara Voss have demonstrated, under conditions that were neither fair nor anticipated, that humanity's capacity for diplomatic engagement is genuine, and that any future assessment of this species must account for a range of responses that current documentation does not adequately describe.'" He looked up from the tablet. She wanted it in the document itself, not in a preamble, not in supplementary notes, in the body of the agreement. I read it back to myself once in my head. "I have no objection to that language," I said. He made a notation. Then he said, still looking at the tablet, "My preliminary report to the Academic Council has been circulated. There is considerable discussion." "Good discussion or concerned discussion?" I asked. "Both," he said. "The scholars who study first contact scenarios are mostly good discussion. Lord Van Sol's office sent a formal inquiry about my methodology." He said this with the tone of someone who finds a formal inquiry from Lord Van Sol's office about as threatening as light rain. "I have responded to the inquiry." "What did you say?" He looked up. "I said that my methodology was direct observation of available evidence, and that the evidence was unusual enough to require unusual documentation. I also said that I intended to continue documentation, and that I had requested an assignment to the Human Contact Mission in an advisory capacity." "She told me about that request," I said. "She approved it this morning," he said. Something settled in me that I had not realized was unsettled. "Good," I said. "I'm glad." He nodded once, with the brief economy of someone who is pleased but sees no reason to expand on it. We walked together to the signing chamber, through corridors that were already becoming familiar, which is the thing about any place you inhabit long enough under any circumstances, it becomes known. The obsidian and the crystal and the 2 high ceilings, and the crystalline lamps were no longer alien in the way they had been when I walked beneath them with chains on my wrists. They were simply the setting. The princess was already in the signing chamber when we arrived. She was standing at the table, not seated, and the agreement was laid out in front of her, on both a crystal slab and a hard copy format that I suspected had been produced specifically for me, since paper was not a standard Veil medium. She looked at me as I came in. "Commander Voss," she said. "Your Highness," I said. We stood on opposite sides of the table. The agreement was 12 pages in standard, and somewhat longer in Veil, since Veil legal language favored precision over brevity. I read every word of the standard version, slowly and carefully, because signing something you have not read is the kind of decision that feels expedient in the moment and complicated forever after. The princess waited, without any impatience that I could detect. When I finished, I looked up. "Paragraph 7, I said, "the communication protocol. It specifies a 48-hour response window for distress signals from human vessels in sovereignty-adjacent space." "Yes," she said. "I would ask for 36 hours, I said. 48 is too long in a genuine emergency." She considered this. Then she turned to one of her advisors, a short, quiet Veil who had been standing near the wall and who appeared to have spent the morning reviewing the same document. They exchanged 3 sentences in Veil. The advisor made a notation on a separate tablet. The princess turned back to me. 36 hours, she said. Agreed. The advisor crossed to the table and made the correction on the agreement before I could change my mind, or she could change hers. We signed. My signature in standard, hers in Veil script, both on both copies, with Vayan Keth and the quiet advisor as witnesses. When it was done, we both stood back from the table. "There is something I want to say to you," the princess said. "It is not a formal statement. It is personal." "Go ahead," I said. "When I arrived on your ship," she said, "I came to demonstrate what I believed was your species' place in the order of the galaxy. A small, disorganized, pre-contact civilization that had made the mistake of arriving in space that was not theirs." She paused. "I treated you accordingly." "I know," I said. "I was wrong," she said. "Not simply wrong in my assessment of your capacity, though I was wrong in that as well. Wrong in the principle. Wrong to decide that your place was mine to assign before I had any genuine understanding of what you were." I looked at her. "Does that happen often? With new species?" "More often than I would like," she said. "We have been in space for a very long time, long enough for certainty to become habitual, long enough for the templates to feel like truth." "That's honest," I said. "You have earned honesty," she said, "at significant personal cost." "Most things worth earning cost something," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "What the Korath told us, that phrase I described, about a species that does not acknowledge concluded situations. I have been thinking about it since yesterday. What about it?" "I think they were wrong about the reason," she said. "They interpreted it as aggression, as unwillingness to accept defeat, as a form of stubbornness that made you dangerous. And you think it's something else?" "I think," she said slowly, "it is what you described, that you simply do not accept endings that have been imposed rather than reached, that you look at a closed door and search for the hinge, not because you are incapable of accepting closure, but because you are incapable of accepting that someone else's definition of closure is final." She paused. "That is not aggression," she said. "That is a different kind of sovereignty, the sovereignty of a species that refuses to let anyone else write the last word of their story." I thought about this for a long moment. "That's the most accurate thing anyone has said about us in this entire conversation," I said. "I will have it included in the file," she said. I almost smiled. She noticed. "You're amused," she said. "You told me the file was going to be updated," I said. "I'm glad to contribute to it." "You have contributed rather more than a notation," she said. And from the faint, precise quality of her voice, I could hear the thing that was not quite amusement, but was in that direction, her own version of it, private and internal, not expressed outward, the way she had said. I thought about what I had said to her the day before. That sounded lonely. And she had said, "It is sometimes." I decided, in that moment, that one of the things I wanted to see in whatever came next between our species was more of that expressed outward, not because the Veil owed us anything so personal, but because a galaxy where more beings could laugh at the same things, and cry at the same things, and recognize themselves in each other's responses, seemed like a significantly better galaxy than one where every species was perfectly contained within its own experience, certain of itself, and isolated in that certainty. We had a long way to go, but we had taken the first step. And as anyone who has ever walked a very long road will tell you, the first step is the one that matters most, because it is the one that determines whether you are going to walk at all. I was going to walk. We both were. 3 months later, I am standing in a room that did not exist when I arrived in Vale space. It is a station. New construction. Fast by any standard. Extraordinary by Vale standards because the Vale do not typically move quickly on anything structural or permanent. They build for centuries, and they build accordingly, with the patience and precision of a civilization that fully expects to be using what it creates, long after every person involved in the creation is gone. This station was built in 11 weeks, which Vayan Keth told me was, in Vale academic terms, practically instantaneous, and had required a formal exception from the Architectural Permanence Board, which is the kind of committee that only exists in a civilization old enough to need rules about how quickly you are allowed to build things. The station floats at the exact gravitational midpoint between the outermost settled Terran system and the innermost Vale boundary marker. It is not in anyone's sovereign space. It belongs to both sides equally, and therefore to neither. This was deliberate. This was the first and most important point the princess and I had agreed on in the preliminary communications that followed the signing. The table where we met could not be in anyone's house. The room itself is circular. The table in the center is circular. Every element of the design was reviewed by both diplomatic teams for any element that could be read as hierarchical or asymmetrical, any feature that placed one side subtly above or below or ahead of the other. It took 6 weeks of back and forth to reach a design that both sides accepted. The final result looks simple. Simple things, when they carry this much intention, are very hard to make. Around the circular table sit representatives of 8 civilizations: the Vale, us, and 6 others. The 5 observer civilizations that had been watching through the secondary broadcast channels sent formal introduction requests within 2 weeks of the court broadcast. 2 of them arrived at the station before the paint, metaphorically speaking, was dry. The 6th was a species that had not been on the Vale's observer list at all, that had simply appeared in communication space approximately 3 weeks after the broadcast, identified themselves as the Serath Compact, and asked, with great politeness and what I had come to understand as their characteristic directness, whether the invitation to the table was open or by prior arrangement only. I had told them it was open. The Terran Interstellar Council had opinions about this. Several of them were strong opinions, and several of those strong opinions were delivered to me at considerable volume through the communication channel on the Resolute, during the weeks when I was still on the station, working out the preliminary framework with the Princess and Vayan Keth, and a progressively growing cast of diplomatic players. The Council's strongest opinion was that I had exceeded my mandate significantly, and that the diplomatic agreement I had signed on behalf of humanity was of dubious legal standing, and would need to be reviewed, ratified, re-reviewed, and potentially renegotiated by properly credentialed diplomatic professionals. My response was that they were welcome to renegotiate anything they liked, that I had preserved the lives of 41 crew members, recovered the remains of 23 people who deserved to come home, established a communication channel with the most powerful civilization in this region of the galaxy, and created a table where 6 additional species were now prepared to sit down, and that if the Council wanted to send credentialed diplomatic professionals to handle the paperwork, I would appreciate it if they could do so within the next 30 days, before the momentum of the thing was lost. They sent 3 credentialed diplomatic professionals within 10 days. They also sent a formal commendation. And then, as Priya had predicted with the complete certainty of someone who knows how institutions work, a promotion. I did not feel particularly different after the promotion. I felt the same way I had felt before it, which was tired, in the specific way that comes from sustained high-stakes engagement, and pleased in the specific way that comes from work that has resulted in something real. The morning of the first formal summit session, I arrived at the circular table 30 minutes early. Vayan Keth was already there. He was standing near the wall where his crystal tablet was connected to the station's internal network, reviewing something on the display with the forward attention posture I had come to associate with him being interested in a problem. He looked up when I came in. "The Serath representatives arrived overnight," he said. I know. I received their arrival notice at 0300. Did you sleep? 4 hours, I said. He made a notation on his tablet that I was fairly sure was personal rather than professional, the kind of note a person makes when they are documenting something for themselves rather than the record. Then he said, I have completed the first formal revision of the human species assessment file. How long is it? Currently 340 pages, he said, with 17 appendices. That's significantly longer than the original, I said. The original was 11 pages, he said. 11 pages for a species that had been in space for less than a decade, based on signal intercepts and the Korath advisory. He paused. I have recommended to the Academic Council that the original file be permanently archived as a reference example of the dangers of insufficient data. That's generous, I said. It is accurate, he said. Generosity and accuracy coincide sometimes. I went to the large window on the far side of the room, the one that looked out toward the region of space that was neither Terran nor Vale, and I looked at the stars for a moment, in the way that I had caught the princess not looking at them, because she carried what was out there internally, rather than needing the visual reminder. I needed the visual reminder. I needed to see the actual stars and remember that they were real places, that the distances between them were real distances, that the civilizations moving through that space were real civilizations with their own histories, and their own failures and their own particular shapes of stubbornness and creativity and fear. Seeing it, rather than thinking it, kept it correctly scaled. The door opened behind me and I turned. Princess Sail Vane came in with 2 of her advisors. One of them was Lord Vane's soul, who had argued against the continuance provision in the Grand Court, and who had managed, over the past 3 months, a transition from outright opposition to something I would describe as cautious engagement, which in a person of his seniority and certainty represented significant movement. The princess looked at me when she came in, a brief, direct look that carried in it the 3 months of communications and negotiations and framework drafting that had passed between us. We had spoken more times in 3 months than most diplomatic counterparts speak in years, because the situation had required it, and because, I suspected, the conversation was one that neither of us wanted to let go of. Commander Voss, she said. Your Highness, I said. Then, your presence here is greatly appreciated, officially and personally. She gave me the brief, small thing that was her closest external expression of satisfaction. The feeling is mutual, she said. Officially and personally. Van Keth made a notation. The other representatives arrived over the following hour. I will not catalog all of them here, because their stories are their own, and they deserve their own telling. What I will say is that the being from the Serath Compact was smaller than I had expected, with a compact, watchful energy, and a particular way of sitting that made them look like they were prepared to move in any direction at any moment, and that they shook my hand without being asked, which surprised me enough that I said so. We have researched the gesture, they said, through their translation matrix. We understand it indicates openness, and the absence of a weapon in the hand. We find this a reasonable beginning. It is, I said. We also understand, they said, that you extended this gesture to the Vale Princess, at first contact, and that she did not know what it meant. That's accurate, I said. We are pleased to know what it means, they said, and released my hand with the satisfied air of someone who has correctly executed a thing they practiced. The session opened at mid-cycle, which was a compromised time zone that landed in nobody's ideal schedule, and was therefore fair to everyone. I was not the lead diplomat. That role had been filled by the credentialed professionals the council sent, 2 senior ambassadors named Lena Marchetti and Gideon Park, who were excellent at their work and who had, over 3 months of collaborative framework drafting, come to understand the particular shape of what had been started here, and were committed to preserving it rather than restructuring it into something more conventionally recognizable. Lena opened the session with the formal language that the occasion required, and she did it with grace and precision. The representatives of each species offered their formal introductions in their own languages, rendered through the translation array that had taken 4 separate technical teams working in parallel to construct, and then the first real agenda item was placed on the table. The 23. Ambassador Marchetti had handled the formal diplomatic process around the recovery and repatriation of the 23 lost crew members with quiet, meticulous care. The princess's written acknowledgement had been transmitted to the council. The remains had been recovered from Vale custody and were already in transit toward Earth, aboard a ship that carried a Vale diplomatic observer alongside the human crew, which was the princess's suggestion, and which I thought was exactly right. 23 families would receive their people back. 23 people who had gone into the dark would be able to come home. During the session's opening remarks, when the formal statement on the matter was read into the record, I let myself stay quiet and present with it for a moment before moving forward, not performing emotion, just acknowledging what it cost and what it meant. Callum was on the Resolute, out of the session, because he was crew rather than diplomatic personnel. I thought about him when the statement was read. I thought about the quiet way he had said thank you in the diplomatic quarters on the Vale station, without embellishment or excess, just the plain fact of the feeling. I thought about his friend. I thought about 23 specific people who had been curious enough and committed enough to climb into small vessels and push toward something unknown, and about how the version of the story where they simply disappeared was not the ending they deserved. This was a better ending, not a good one. Nothing about 23 deaths becomes good, but better. After the session, I found a moment to stand alone at the window in the corridor outside the main chamber. The station was still new enough that it smelled of construction and ozone, the particular scent of recently sealed materials. The view from the corridor window was different from the one in the chamber, angled more toward the Terran side of the gravitational midpoint, and I could just barely resolve the light of our nearest settled system if I knew where to look. I knew where to look. The princess found me there. She came without her advisors, which I had learned was how she indicated that what followed was personal rather than official. She stood at the window beside me and looked out at the same view I was looking at, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she said, "Lord Vayan Sol told me this morning that he believes the summit has a reasonable probability of producing lasting results." "That's high praise from Lord Vayan Sol," I said. "It is the highest praise he has given anything in the past decade," she said. He said it slightly grudgingly, which is how he says things he genuinely believes. "How is he finding the other species?" I asked. "He is fascinated by the Serath," she said. "He will not admit this, but he has been researching them since their arrival request came in, and I can tell when he is fascinated because he stops complaining about things for several days at a time." "And the Serath?" "The Serath," she said, with the careful quality she used when she was choosing words precisely, "find the Vale very interesting. They described us in their preliminary materials as old and certain in ways that are worth examining, which Vayan Keth tells me is, in Serath diplomatic language, a significant compliment." "I can work with that," I said. She looked out the window. "There are 42 settled civilizations in this region of the galaxy," she said. "The sovereignty has formal or informal relations with 11 of them. Your species has encountered 4. That we know of," I said. "That you know of," she agreed. "We're going to encounter more," I said. "Yes," she said, "you are. You are moving in a great many directions simultaneously, and you are moving at a rate that is, by any historical standard, quite fast." She paused. "This used to concern me." "And now?" "Now it concerns me differently," she said. "Less as a territorial matter, more as a logistical one. You are going to encounter species that are not interested in tables or conversations. You are going to encounter situations where the options you prefer are not available." "We know," I said. "And you will proceed anyway," she said. "We will try every other option first," I said. "And then yes, we will proceed anyway." "I know," she said. "I have read Vayan Keth's file." She paused. 340 pages. "He mentioned it," I said. 17 appendices, she said. "One of them is dedicated entirely to the specific cognitive process that appears to underlie your species' approach to situations that have been deemed impossible by external assessment." "What does it say?" "It says," she said slowly, "that humans appear to process external assessments of impossibility as information rather than instruction, that you hear, 'This cannot be done,' and you treat it as a description of the current state of the problem, rather than a conclusion about its final state." She paused. "He calls it the hinge-seeking response." I recognized the phrase I had used with her, early in our private conversation. She had told Vayan Keth, He had made it a formal term. I like that, I said. It is accurate, she said. We stood at the window for another moment. Then she said something that I had not expected, something that surprised me the way real things surprise you, not with drama, but with the quiet force of a truth that has been waiting for exactly the right moment to arrive. I have been thinking, she said, about what you said in my chambers, that not being able to share something outward is sometimes lonely. You said it is sometimes, I said. Yes, she said. I have been thinking about that response, about whether it was true, and whether I would have said it if the context had been different. She was quiet for a moment. I think it was true, and I think I would not have said it to anyone else. Why? I asked. Because, she said, you were the first being in my experience who asked in a way that expected an honest answer, rather than a diplomatic one. You did not ask it as a gesture. You said it because you meant it. I did mean it, I said. I know, she said. That is what made it possible to answer. Outside, the stars burned cold and quiet. The session inside the chamber was continuing without us, the formal language of multiple civilizations, finding its slow and careful way toward something that could be agreed on, something that would hold. Lena and Gideon were good at this. They would manage. I stood at the window and thought about the 60-second platform in the Grand Court, and about the seam in the wall that I had fixed my attention on while the chains ran their cycle, and about the small, quiet smile I had offered the Princess of the Veil sovereignty before I had any right to be smiling at anything. I had smiled because I was still thinking. I had smiled because being in a situation that looked finished from the outside was not the same as the situation actually being finished. I had smiled because every human being who has ever walked into the dark toward something unknown, toward something that other people said could not be reached or survived or negotiated with, has done it with some version of that same small, quiet certainty, that the last word has not been written yet, and that they are the ones still holding the pen. The princess was right about what the Korath had missed. It was not aggression. It was not stubbornness in the ordinary sense. It was the fundamental, bone-deep refusal to accept someone else's final chapter. We write our own. We have always written our own. That is not a claim to superiority. Other species are faster, older, more powerful, more precise. They have technologies that make ours look like rough sketches. They have histories that stretch back further than our civilization has existed. They have capacities that we cannot match, and will perhaps never match. But none of that determines the ending. The ending is still being written. I turned from the window. Behind me, through the chamber doors, I could hear the formal proceedings continuing, the measured voices of 8 civilizations finding the language for something new. Vayan Keth's voice, at one point, precise and clear, offering a scholarly note that the other representatives listened to with the attention his care earned. Ahead of me, in every direction, the galaxy was full of unknowns. Species we had not met, spaces we had not mapped, situations we had not imagined that would require everything we had and more, that would push against us until it was very clear whether or not we were going to keep going. We were going to keep going. I knew this the way I knew the feel of the Resolute under my feet, the way I knew the sound of Priya on a communication channel, and Dara at an engine console, and Yemi making coffee at 0400 when the watch needed it. I knew it the way you know the things that are simply true. The princess was still at the window. She had not moved. She was looking at the stars now, actually looking at them, rather than through them, with the attention of someone who has decided to let the view do what it does. Sail Vayan, I said. Not your highness. Not princess. Her name. She looked at me. Thank you, I said, for listening, when it would have been easier not to. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she said, very precisely, as if she had been practicing how to produce the specific effect she intended. You were worth listening to. And there it was, the plain fact of the thing, offered without ceremony, and without diplomatic wrapping, just the honest statement of one being to another, across the distances of biology and history, and 11,000 years of certainty that was learning, slowly, and with some difficulty, to be less certain. I went back into the chamber. The work was waiting. The work is always waiting. And we will always be there to do it. That is the deal we made, 10,000 years ago, when the first of us looked at the horizon and decided that whatever was on the other side of it was worth walking toward. We have been walking ever since. We are not going to stop.